I'm Kate Gardner. I'm Executive Director of Alpha Sigma Nu, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Leveraging Your Jesuit Skillset. Before we get started, I have some future events for Alpha Sigma Nu events to share with you. This Monday at 5:30 Central Time, Alpha Sigma Nu will host a virtual info session on Jesuit service. Representatives from the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, the Alumni Service Corps, and the Jesuit Volunteer Corps Northwest will be joining us. Look for details at the ASN website and on our social media. John Carroll is partnering with us, Alpha Sigma Nu, and the International Association of Jesuit Universities to host an international student panel entitled Caring for Our Common Home, Our Hope-Filled Future. This Ignatian Year event will take place on Zoom next Thursday, a week from tonight, at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. So this event will have an international a panel of students talking about climate change and caring for our common home, and you're all welcome. Look for details about our Alpha Sigma Nu Lenten series coming up. The lead-off speaker will be Father Jim Martin speaking on prayer. And you want to, if you're interested, make sure you sign up early because we have a limited number of spaces. Also, last week I talked to a representative from Active Minds, who, interestingly enough, not only was an Alpha Sigma Nu Marquette grad, but an Alpha Sigma Nu member. And we'll be hosting a talk on mental health and Ignatian spirituality. So if you're interested, again, watch your email and ASN social media for details. So like we were just talking about, this evening, chapter members from across the Alpha Sigma Nu network join us to hear from career services professional Branden Grimmett, who will share his wisdom on leveraging your Jesuit skill set. Now, I know you are all veterans and maybe over much veterans of Zoom, but I remind you to stay muted until Branden asks for questions and comments. So I'm delighted to introduce you to Branden Grimmett. Students spoke so highly of Branden's presentation last year that we invited him to make this an annual event. And Branden, we certainly appreciate you returning. Branden joined Loyola Marymount University as Associate Provost in June of 2015. He leads LMU's Career and Professional Development team. In this role, he oversees the office responsible for successfully launching all LMU undergraduate and graduate students into their professional careers. 96% of LMU undergrads and 98% of grad students from the class of 2020 were employed, enrolled in grad school, or pursuing postgraduate service within 6 months of their graduation. Before joining LMU, Branden held similar leadership roles in career development at St. Olaf College, at Tufts University, and Harvard University. He received his EDD in Higher Ed Administration from the University of Southern California, his MTS from Harvard University in Theological Studies, and his BA in Music and Religion from St. Olaf College. Branden is a particularly appropriate keynote for this evening's event because he's a great believer in networking and an even greater believer in Jesuit alumni's interest and generosity in networking with students. Branden, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Kate, for that generous introduction. I'm actually going to share screen so you can see a little bit more of what I have planned today. So just give me a minute to do that. Can everyone see the PowerPoint now? Okay, excellent.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you for that response. It's always nice when someone unmutes to tell me. So today I'm going to be talking about the Jesuit skill set because I think that we don't always know what it is, and we don't always know how to talk about it, especially when we're interfacing with audiences other than our Jesuit colleagues and classmates and faculty and staff. So today is going to be both hopefully a refresher on what it is you've been experiencing at your own institutions in terms of the learning and the takeaways that you've been a part of, but probably for most of you, I'm going to be helping you translate what it is you've been experiencing in ways that employers, alumni, and other people that are going to be helpful to your own career will understand. And so my goal is to be practical, helpful, and to make sure that you've got some value out of the time that you're spending with me today. So where we're going to start is we're going to actually define the Jesuit skill set, and I've taken a bit of time to research each of the institutions within the HACU to see how they're positioning those skill sets, both from an admission standpoint and making sure that they market those skills to prospective students, but more importantly, how they're positioning you as students when they help you enter the job market. And we'll talk about what those are. We'll also discuss ways that we can strategically and effectively leverage these skills. And of course, we're going to leverage those skills not just for learning's sake, but really to make sure you've got an outcome that matches your values, your interests, the things that you're ultimately committed to. And that's something that's also a part of Jesuit education, is looking at your own identity and the needs of the world and thinking about what changes you can make to the society around you. And we'll talk more about that. We also, as Kate mentioned, want to talk about harnessing the power of the Jesuit Alumni Network. And the great thing about this is that no matter what institution you're at, no matter if there's a big career center or a small career center, if you've used it or you haven't, all of you are going to be joining an alumni base from your institution, but maybe more importantly, an alumni base that collectively is quite large between all the AJCU institutions. And so we'll talk about how to best put your foot forward, how to tell stories that are memorable, and also how to make a really good first impression for those meetings. And then finally, mentoring is not just about figuring out what you need from someone and asking of that. It's actually about a two-way street where you are mentored by someone who takes an interest in you, but also where you help to give back to them by validating their career choices and giving them some feedback and some responses to their own decision making that has either been academic in nature or professional in nature. So that's what we're going to spend time on today. And I'm, as Kate mentioned, going to spend plenty of time turning it over to students here, especially the chapter presidents, to respond to my remarks, and also just to take questions from the entire audience that's here. By way of introduction, I know that you heard some of this from the opening, but I want to show you just kind of visually what has brought me to this moment. And you've heard that I am a graduate of St. Olaf, Harvard, and USC. You know perhaps that I work at LMU right now, but I previously worked at Tufts, at Harvard. I'm actually teaching a course in career development at USC this semester for master's in counseling students. I'm also a member of the LGBTQ Presidents in Higher Education. I'm not a college president, but I aspire to be one day. And there's an association that allows aspiring college presidents to be a part of that membership. In addition, I sit on the board of Lutheran Volunteer Corps, and I previously worked for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. The reason I want to show you all of this is because each of you, if you haven't already, are going to be asked to introduce yourselves in an interview or in some kind of networking session. And it can be really important to think not just about what you're currently doing and what your current role is as a student or a soon-to-be graduate, but really to package what it is that you've done at previous places and to think about all elements of who you are and why that's important to who you're talking to. And so we'll actually talk about how to do those introductions and make sure that you come away with something quite tangible. So just to get our appetites wet to this, the question is, who are we? We're all educated in a Jesuit institution. We all have career aspirations and academic aspirations, but each of those are unique to who you are and to your formation. And perhaps as a member of Alpha Sigma Nu, the kinds of things you've been doing to give back to your own communities and also to each other. So I want you to think about this. And if any of you are inclined, you can certainly put it in the chat so I have some sense of where you're coming from, but it's only if you choose to do that. But to think about the motivation for why you attended your institution. When I first meet with students, one of the first things I ask them is, why did you come to LMU? What did you have in mind when you came as a first year or transfer student? And what did that look like academically and also from a career perspective? I then ask them to tell me how that's changed over time. And I never give them the option to not answer that second part of the question, because it's always changed for every student. So think about where you were maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, but also think about where you are today. And again, if you want to share any of this with your colleagues or even with me privately, I'd be happy to read that in the chat. I also want you to think about what your post-college career goal is. For some of you, for many of you, it probably will be employment, full-time employment, maybe even after taking some time off over the summer or whatever term you're graduating. But for others, it might be continued discernment. And it might also lead you to things other than employment, such as graduate and professional school, postgraduate service, fellowships like Fulbright or the Rotary, but also perhaps military service or just taking some time to assess what your next steps are. I want to take a moment to say that discernment is not like a machine where it happens in 4 years. It's perfectly fine for some of you to take more time to discern what happens after college and for others to know exactly what they want to do much earlier. And so try to free yourself from making any qualitative judgments about your own process and timeline. And I think that's going to provide a lot less anxiety in the job search. Speaking of anxieties, I know that many of you probably have questions and also concerns and maybe even fears about what comes after college, and that's completely natural as well. The way I like to think about the phase of your life that you're entering is that prior to college, you had presumably 12 years of education that allowed you to go to one of your institutions. Some of you had some work experience before that, but you definitely had more educational experiences than you've had work experiences. So everything currently and behind you is familiar. Everything in front of you is quite new. And so you should be giving yourself a lot of grace to think about this newness and what it is you want to bring into that space. And again, as I mentioned before, it's not just what you're doing currently or what your aspirations are, it's all of who you are, whether it's your work experience, your professional identity, your personal identity, in other parts of who you are as a person. So thanks for thinking about that. And again, it's a good exercise, I think, to get yourself into this discussion we're going to have. Now I want to actually talk about the Jesuit skill set and focus on what I have defined as something that's common to all the institutions you see on the left. So there is a map of where you all presumably are, and apologies because I didn't know we'd have folks joining from overseas, but think of this as just one map of many, and we know that there are many other Jesuit institutions around the globe. I'm going to actually walk us through how I define some of these Jesuit skill sets, and hopefully none of this will be new to you, but I think that it's important to both indicate what they are, but also to define them. So for the most part, I would say that every Jesuit institution on this list, at least, is a liberal arts institution, which means that all of you have received or are still receiving a well-rounded education that allows you to not just focus on your major, but more importantly, other things that are going to help you be a well-rounded individual, whether that's educationally or professionally. Persons with and for others essentially means that you're thinking beyond yourself. And again, I know this is very much review for all of you who've been a part of the network, but this has a huge implication for when we think about the workplace and what it means to be a good employee and a good colleague, and we'll talk more about that. Values into action. I think that any graduate of a Jesuit institution really understands how to both, care about something and how to know that this is something that is quite valuable to you, but also how to translate that care and that commitment into action that makes a difference, not just in your own life, but in other people's lives. And we'll talk more about what that looks like. Critical thinking, of course, is a component of any liberal arts education, and especially Jesuit education. And what that does is allows you to think even deeper on a level that once you start getting into the workplace, you'll realize sets you apart from your colleagues, from your employees at your company, because you're looking at things at much more than just a surface level. And for any systemic issue, whether it's institutional racism or homophobia or some sort of gender discrimination, we need that critical lens to be able to understand what is happening and to decolonize that work in our workplaces. All of you, I think, just by virtue of being here today, are leaders, and you have shown leadership experience in your work. And so that has been really important as well. The global understanding, again, I'm really grateful for those of you that are calling from abroad, because this is not only important for us to get your perspective, but it's also important for the students studying in the United States to understand how to navigate and weave in between cultures, how to honor the cultures that you're interacting with, and how not to minimize or essentialize those cultures, especially once you get into the workplace. Just a few more left. Commitment to social justice. This tends to be a strong theme within ASN, of course, but more so on our college campuses, whether it's doing service work as a part of your service organizations, or even just thinking about activism on campus and thinking about how to be a strong voice, especially for those that don't have as much power or privilege as you might have. Empathy is something that I think is embedded within the Jesuit skill set. And of course, this means that you're putting yourself in someone else's shoes, especially if you haven't had a similar experience to them. And so one of the things I see dwindling in our current culture, at least in the West, is empathy. And we're looking for more of that, not just in our global community, but in our workplaces, because that's often when disagreements can lead to better understanding if we take that approach. Care for the individual, which means that we're not overlooking individual needs that might be dire or quite urgent, but we're thinking about the whole while we're also thinking about the individual. And so for some of you, that means the kind of work that you're going into, the kind of majors that you've chosen are going to be really critical to understanding how you can have some influence over things that might have an impact on individual people's lives. And then finally, magis, which of course is a Latin word and phrase and idea, which is translated mostly to mean more, but I'm going to nuance this a little bit and make sure we understand that more is not always better. And so there's a slight variation of that definition I want to explain to you in the next slide. So there they are again, and we're going to talk about something called translation. And the reason I'm focused on translation is because, as I mentioned earlier, my belief is that some of this is insider language. Some of this is language that is only known and only understood by people that have been Jesuit educated or familiar to people who hail from one of our institutions. So my whole point in thinking about a translation of this is to make sure that when you interact with alumni, but maybe more importantly, hiring managers or graduate admission professionals, that you're able to explain what it is you gain from your institution experience and from your education in ways that make sense to those audiences. So when I say a holistic liberal arts education, what I mean by that is that we are well-rounded. We're able to learn quickly. This has lots of relevance for on-the-job learning because many employers today are taking a risk by hiring anyone, right? There's a lot of competition for jobs, and they want to make sure that if they take a risk on any candidate, especially if you don't have exactly the experience that they're looking for, that you can learn that quickly. And the reason you're all going to be prepared to do that is because you've had to jump between different subject matters and disciplines throughout your time at your college or university, and you've proven to yourself and to your faculty and to those around you that you can do that. When we look at persons with and for others, this is really a commitment to service, right? So it's thinking about something other than ourselves. Persons with and for others may not make sense to a typical employer, but it definitely makes sense when you tell them that you're committed to service and going above and beyond what it is that that job might require for you. Values into action is really about integrity and honesty. Are your behaviors reflective of the things that you say you care about? Are you doing the kind of work that's needed based upon what it is that you care about and what kind of beliefs you hold? So think about how you might demonstrate what it is that you're committed to, your ultimate values and goals professionally and personally as you enter this professional space, whether it's an internship or a full-time job interview. Critical thinking, really just analytical skills. That's as much as I can say about that. So again, going a little bit beyond a surface level analysis of especially more societal issues that impact all of us as humans. Leadership experience is really about communication. If you think about people that you admire as leaders, they're almost always good communicators, and they're almost always able to influence people's behavior or their decision making because they're good communicators. So think about what elements you've been able to achieve in terms of great communication styles or themes, and also think about examples that you can share, especially with admissions professionals for graduate school and also for employers that are recruiting you, that show that you have honed your communication style and you're able to influence whether it's a team in a group project or those that are in your audience. Global understanding is really today, I think, phrased as diversity, equity, and inclusion, or intercultural fluency. So you want to think about how your experience either studying abroad or going to diverse campuses and being right next to people that come from different backgrounds and cultures have actually allowed you to learn a little bit more about humanity, about how humanity is diverse, about how there is inequity in our societies, no matter where we live or come from, that needs to be balanced and reshifted by being an inclusive person and actor. Commitment to social justice is really an agent of change, right? And so if we're committed to this, we want things to be different than the status quo. This also connects a little bit to leadership, because in order for things to change, we have to speak up, right? If we don't speak up, those of us that are paying attention will assume that we are in favor of the status quo. So if you're committed to this, you're definitely an agent of change. Empathy. Is this person a thoughtful colleague? Are they an employee that I want to be around? So as you make this transition from classmate to employee, it's really important to note that oftentimes in the interview process, your colleagues or potential colleagues are not just going to be assessing whether you've got the skills or the knowledge to do something. They're more importantly going to be asking, do I want to spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 52 weeks out of the year with this person? And that's really important. Finally, care for the individual. Are you personable? Are you relatable? I'm seeing some of your faces here on the screen, and your cameras are on, and I can see you smiling and responding. That's a part of the skill set of showing that you're attentive and you're also paying attention to what's happening in front of you. And then finally, just going the extra mile. What I mean by going the extra mile is that it doesn't mean more of something. You don't have to overdo anything. But what I like to define it as is if your supervisor or your manager has asked you to do something really concrete, what would it look like to do something a little bit more thorough with that job, whether it's an assignment in the classroom or maybe in the workplace, something that might be a project or a presentation. So, and I'm going to send this presentation to Kate after the session for those of you that are kind of frantically taking notes, so that you don't have to memorize all this or remember to write it down. So no worries there. So as we think about the translation activity, I think it's important to think about this also in a theoretical way. And just bear with me, because you probably didn't expect to get into theory at an ASN event on an afternoon or evening. But this is a really important part of what I want to share with you, because I don't want anyone on this webinar to feel any kind of shame or inadequacy because you don't know some of the things that are happening, right? So what I want to explain to you is that whenever we're starting something new, whether it's learning how to navigate the job search, learning how to build mentoring relationships, or learning how to network, we all start by not knowing that. We all start by not knowing that jobs are secured by knowing someone that works at that company. So if you have looked around you on your campus and seen people that are really expert networkers, or people that are really fluent in speaking when it comes to interviewing, just know that they've actually had to practice that and got better at it in order to be as impressive as you think they are. Now, when we look at this bottom part of the pyramid, anything that we're trying to learn as students or as learners, we're starting from a place of not knowing what we don't know. It's possible that some of what I've already shared with you, you didn't know before today. And so if you hadn't come to this session, if you hadn't said yes to the invitation, especially later in the presentation when I talk about cover letters and resumes, you would essentially be operating from the wrong intuition about how to navigate your job search, right? And so being in a place like this meeting, saying yes to something that you may not totally understand what's going to happen, signing up for something that looks great on paper, but you're not quite sure what you're going to get out of it, can be a way to get you from not knowing what you don't know to essentially knowing what you don't know. So by being here today, all of you have at least gotten out of that red zone and into the yellow zone, because you're learning some things perhaps that you didn't know before. And most importantly, the conscious incompetence, or knowing what you don't know, means that you're now aware of that gap and you can do something about it. Where I think we all need to be eventually is practicing what it is that we do know, right? And so whether it's communication, introducing yourselves, talking about the Jesuit skill set and translating that into employer speak, that's all something that you now know how to do. And you can practice that and get better at it. You can flex those muscles and become more competent in it, to the point where it becomes automatic and you don't have to think too much about it. Now, the only way that we can actually learn all of this is I have to be able to speak to you, because a lot of this obviously comes natural for me because I've been doing this work for many years in career services. But I think that the best teachers and the best people to expound on different kinds of competencies are people that have to remember how they learned something, right? And so in order for me to put this presentation together, I had to remember, well, how did I even think about, introducing myself, or cover letters or resumes, or some of those basics that are really important for the job search. So you need to get yourself from the red zone to the yellow zone, and experts need to get themselves from the blue zone to the green zone in order to communicate effectively. Another way to look at this is to look at a chart that is in 4 stages. So let's say that you take my advice after this presentation and you reach out to a member of the alumni community to get to know what it is that their path has been and how their time at your same institution was really beneficial to them. You're going to go from a place of pure bliss, not knowing what you don't know, perhaps to one where you start to question, oh, this person had my same major, but they decided to take a couple extra computer science courses, or maybe they weren't so keen on the major and they decided they wanted to switch, gears halfway through their college experience. So becoming aware of these things, either through mentoring conversations or through networking conversations, can often lead to curiosity and becoming better at flexing that muscle and building that skill. That's going to take some effort. And so for those of you that are on the job search right now, I want you to know that it's perfectly natural to feel stressed about it. If you don't feel stressed, you're probably not doing enough. But it is a stressful moment, and it's partially stressful because you don't know what's on the other side of this graduation date, but it's also stressful because all of this activity is new for you. And I want you to know that that is normal. If you have done a lot of this work and you start to make it second nature and you set some personal goals for yourself, going to send 5 networking emails per week, going to try to get 1 or 2 job interviews per month for graduation, going to talk to 1 to 2 alumni every week if I can, either through Zoom or via phone or even in person, depending on where you are. What you will find is that networking, mentoring conversations, and even the job search itself is going to become a lot easier. So think about this as a phase that you go through where you don't know something, to becoming aware of what you didn't know, to practicing what you do know, to eventually becoming an expert. If any of you have read Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, there's another way to think about this, which is putting in 10,000 hours of anything that allows you to become an expert and to really have that be operating almost in an intuitive way eventually. So just to give some examples, and I'm certain that every institution has tools like this. At LMU, we have something called the Pride, which is powered by People Grove. And this is a database that allows our students to actually reach out to any of our 70,000 plus alumni working at companies such as Apple, Google, Netflix, SpaceX, etc. If you don't know if your campus has something like this, I'd encourage you to reach out to either your alumni and family engagement office or your career center, because that can be really important as well. Additionally, we want to talk about cover letters. And I have a question for the group, actually, and I'm not going to stop sharing, but I do want to make sure that I hear from someone if they're willing to unmute. But has anyone seen a job application where the cover letter is optional? Anyone seen that? Okay, I see some hands raised. Do we think it really is optional? If someone wants to unmute and give an answer.
Probably not if you want the job.
Yes, and how might that be connected to what I've already shared about Magis?
I think it just proves that you want the job enough to put in the effort of making a cover letter.
Exactly, exactly. And Carla, you had a thought as well.
Yeah, I think it's also important because in the cover letter, you introduce yourself. Maybe they can learn something from you that they cannot see in your resume. And yeah, it's a fast way to know that you're interested in the job and they know you better.
Precisely, right. And so if you can all do me a favor and really do yourselves a favor, whenever there's an opportunity to submit a cover letter, but it's optional, just always submit it, right? And always write it in a way that's tailored toward the opportunity or to the organization that you're applying to. So I'm going to give you a quick framework that I think is really foolproof in terms of making sure that you can make a really strong first impression for your cover letter. One of the things that's going to differentiate your letter from others is by not just focusing on what skills you have and not just focusing on what you've done, but focusing on why you're applying to the job in the first place. If it comes down to 2 candidates who both have the same skills, the same interests, the same experiences, I can guarantee you that the company will always give the job to someone who's more motivated to do the work. So it's really important that in your cover letter, at the onset of the letter, that you explain that the reason you're applying to this organization is because you care about children, for instance, if you're going into an educational organization and you really want to work with children, because perhaps of a personal experience you had, either as a child or working with children as a teacher and educator. If you want to go into sports management, talk about why that's the case, right? And tie it to the organization. So because you are critical thinkers, because you're well-rounded, you can talk about your motivation and drive, which is always attached to your values and the things you care deeply about. Secondly, you want to focus on telling a story. So the cover letter is not a place to rehash everything in your resume, but instead, it's an opportunity to draw the reader in to understand, okay, when I was a student interning at this company, I encountered this problem. My boss asked me to solve it in this way. I did that, but then I went above and beyond and did X, Y, Z. And because of that extra effort, this is what the company organization gained from my contributions, right? So that's a single story that is about one thing, but your goal is to make sure that it's clear. And we'll talk later about how it's important for that to be memorable as well. You will probably find yourself having additional skills that you want to leverage that might not be directly related to the job or to the company and what they're seeking. It's also important to talk about that, right? So maybe you've got graphic design skills, maybe you've got organizational skills or administrative skills, maybe you've helped schedule things for other people, or you've done some research as a student. Disclose all of that and make sure you tie all of that to the job and to the organization that you're working with. It may not seem intuitive to put education forth, but most employers want to know that your education and anything theoretical has been tested in a professional environment before they hire you. So we don't want to lead with education necessarily, but we do want to talk about it. And we want to talk about both formal and informal education. So formal education are obviously courses you've taken at your institution. Informal education might be things that you've learned on the fly, taking LinkedIn learning courses, or maybe doing a boot camp for coding, maybe doing some tutoring and helping English language learners. So all of that can be really impactful as well. And then finally, think about restating all of that and make sure that they know that you're grateful for the time that they spent just to read the letter, right? So before I move on, and I know I went through this quickly because I wanted to save time for questions. And again, I'll send the PowerPoint. I want to see if there's any urgent questions that folks have about, where we are in the presentation, cover letter specifically, and maybe even discuss other strategies that folks have found to be effective in your job search. And again, you can either raise hand or you can unmute and just chime in. Did any of this speak to you in terms of the kinds of structure that we're looking at here?
Brandon, I have a good example. We have a job opening on our staff, and I've read 2 cover letters that never once say the word Jesuit.
Yeah, that's a missed opportunity, right? And that probably would have belonged maybe in the motivation section, right? So, those of you that are on the call are all Jesuit educated. And if you were applying to ASN, you'd want to obviously connect those dots. So great observation, Kate. Claire, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I guess this is a question for maybe if you're incorporating your skills into a more secular job. Do you suggest kind of having the Jesuit ideals blatantly there, or kind of alluding to them, but without necessarily saying I use Magis in, or I guess, how do you kind of, what advice do you have for that?
Sure.
With being authentic in your
Yeah, I understand the question. I think it can go both ways, right? So the reason the previous slide had the translation there was because some of you will want to tone down the jargon of Jesuit education when speaking to an employer that you're certain won't understand it. But you might also take the opportunity to educate that employer about what Jesuit education is, right? And so my kind of middle ground here is that I love to learn new things in cover letters, right? And for people that take the time to read them, I think they often want to say, okay, I read 100 cover letters today. It was that student Claire from which institution?
Marquette University.
Marquette, who took the time to define this Latin word I'd never heard before, but it speaks directly to the kind of ethos we're trying to inspire in our own workforce, right? So I mention that because I think that all of this can differentiate you from people that haven't been Jesuit educated. And I don't mean to be too career-minded about it, but the job search is a competition, right? And so at the end of the day, I want you to do your best. I want you to compete to the best of your ability, but you already have a leg up by being Jesuit educated because that's something that not everyone has, right? So it comes from a place of privilege and you can't abuse that, but you can also use it as a strength, I think, in your application. Did I answer your question?
It did, yeah. And you brought a new perspective that I hadn't thought about. So thank you for sharing that too.
Excellent, great. And we will have more time for additional questions for those of you that have them, but I do want to be mindful of getting through everything here. And so as we switch gears a little bit and talk now about resume, similarly, you're telling a story, but you're not necessarily doing it in formal writing like you would do with a cover letter. So some things to think about with a resume. What outcomes are you achieving, right? I've seen a lot of resumes where the bullets talk about what you were assigned to do in a job, but there's a big difference between what you did because someone told you to do it and what outcomes you achieved because you did that work, right? And so what did you achieve? What did the organization achieve as a result of your work, problems you solved, and then what can be measured in that outcome? So it doesn't all have to be quantifiable. It can also be about duration or the difficulty or the complexity of the work that you were doing. It's also important to talk about who you worked with, right? And so whether it's in your college experience, in clubs, organizations, or volunteering, or whether it's in internships or research that you've conducted off campus, most employers want to know what's the most senior level position you interacted with at that company. Was it, a vice president? Was it a director or coordinator? You don't need to name those people, but you do want to probably mention their title just so that future employers know what kind of communication and maturity and what level within the organization you were interfacing with. So there can be internal stakeholders within that company. There can also be external stakeholders, which are often customers or clients or your audience. And you always want to think about what leadership role you were playing in that effort. Similarly, many of you, whether it's in an internship or a college experience, you've done some work around training and you've received training, both formal and informal. The way I like to think about informal training is if you are in a Zoom room taking an online course and the professor's having trouble with breakout rooms, are you the student that unmutes and explains how to do that? That's what I would call being an informal trainer, right? You're helping faculty to understand how to leverage their technology. And you can think of equivalent stories within an internship, perhaps. And then finally, why did you do all of this, right? So one thing to add at the end of every bullet, mentally, but not in writing, is in order to do what, right? So you might think about a bullet where you talk about, I was a sexual assault prevention trainer on campus. That is a decent bullet, but not completely sufficient. You would want to say, in order to increase the knowledge and confidence of other students to be able to prevent sexual violence on our campus, right? So think about what you did and how that might be connected to the larger goal of the organization or of the position that you were in at the time. So similarly, I do want to take a moment to pause and make sure I haven't moved too fast to see if there are questions about resumes. Because again, this format will help you make sure your bullets have impact and make sure that your bullets tell a more complete story of what it is that you want to convey to your audience. So any thoughts or questions or any additional feedback about resumes? This is like a group career coaching session, by the way.
I had a question.
Yeah,
I'm wondering how much you should change your resume for different applications. if I made a full resume of myself, it would be not long, but it would have a lot on it. But a lot of stuff on there doesn't really apply to, for instance, like this one job. So like when I'm deciding, I guess I don't know how to ask this, like how much is too much, and should I take off like everything that really doesn't directly apply to a specific job that I'm applying to?
It's a great question, and it's a common question, so you're not alone with that. I would say that you want to start by having a what I call kind of an expanded resume where everything that you've ever done is on it, so that you've got some options, right? So have a master document that allows you to see all of the experience that you've ever had, all the different service you've done, all the leadership experience you've had, things like study abroad and volunteering, all of that should be there. Given where you are professionally for most of you, unless you have done a lot of work outside the classroom, you're probably going to end up with a one-page resume. It's important to note that private for-profit companies really prefer the one-page resume. And to your point, Stephen, what you want to think about, okay, is if I have 150% of the content that I can get on one page, if I have to cut 50%, right? Am I going to cut the stuff that's going to be relevant to this job or not, right? And so sometimes you want to have that expanded resume so that you have the option to include things that are relevant for that position. And then when you apply for a second position or a second job, you've got that same document and you can mix and match things that are relevant. Now, I'm going to connect some of what you're asking about to networking, because this is also very important. You're going to have a much better bang for your buck with the job search if you apply to jobs after you've networked with the organization. Why might it be important to apply after you've networked with an organization? Why might it be extremely important to finalize your resume after having networked with someone at that company? And I'll kick it back to you, Stephen. Any thoughts about why talking to someone at your dream company might be a good first step rather than to do that after you've applied?
You'd probably be able to get a better picture of what they're looking for and what they want in you, maybe.
Exactly. In my experience, and Kate, since you're hiring, you can say the same thing if you want to resonate with me. You can only include so much on a job description, right? If I were to talk to Kate about this position that's open and say, well, tell me what is not on the job posting. Tell me what bigger problems you're trying to solve organizationally. All of that is now privileged information that you have that other people do not have. And you can speak to that in a resume, in a cover letter, but you would not have had the opportunity if you networked after you applied.
Mhm.
Are we on the same page, Kate? Is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, I would say we're a small staff at Alpha Sigma Nu, and while I certainly wouldn't require anyone to have necessarily Jesuit higher education experience, at least to an understanding and appreciation of what it means, why are we different than Phi Beta Kappa, should come across somewhere.
Great. Yeah, exactly. And the other point is that I want to make is that when a job has been posted, it's more difficult to network for that particular role, because when you reach out to a hiring manager, they will presume that you're trying to get insider information, right? So the way to play the long game is to know which companies you want to work for as soon as possible, so that you can network regardless of whether there's a job posted that meets your interest or not. So that person's more likely to say yes, and more unlikely to think that you're trying to get kind of insider information. The final thing I'll just say about networking at this point of the conversation is that you definitely do want to wait for that person to ask you for your resume. I generally advise students, when you reach out to a stranger, to not presume that they want to see that document. So if you can get a meeting with them, one of the things you definitely want to say at the end of the meeting is, I really enjoyed my time with you. I learned a lot about your own career path, and what you shared was really helpful for mine. Would you mind if I sent you my resume after this meeting so you can give me a little bit of feedback about the document based upon the goals that I explained to you? I can guarantee you that if you had a good meeting and you make that offer, they will accept the resume and they will give you feedback. And then they've invested in you a little bit, which means that if a position opens up in the future, they will want you to be successful in applying and competing for that job. So try to wait for them to ask for the resume before presuming that they want to see it. Carla, question.
Yeah, I have a question about these skills. I've always had the doubt if it's better to put professional skills, and by that I mean Microsoft Office, coding, or personal skills such as the Jesuit skills, values, or I don't know if it's good to put half-half, or it's gonna depend on the type of job you're applying to.
I actually like skills to be in you can definitely have skills on the resume somewhere, but if you have space for a summary section at the top of your resume before your first professional experience, that can be a nice lens through which the rest of your resume is read, right? And so you might talk about your leadership experience, you might talk about the skills that you have relevant to the job. Whenever I apply for something, I modify that summary section. It's usually no more than 5 bullets at the top. I modify it so that every element of the job that they're trying to hire for is spoken to in those 5 bullets, right? And if I can't speak to them, it means that probably the job is not within reach of competing for, right? So I think it's a great idea. And at the bottom of your page where you've got your skills listed in a separate section, that's where you can probably put more of the tactical skills around software or technology or languages. But you definitely want to speak in the employer's language at the very top of the resume to what they're looking for. Great
Okay,
question.
thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so remember that motivation is really important. So if you remember nothing, remember that motivation is important. That's really important to describe in the cover letter to differentiate yourself from other people that might be equally qualified. And because you are all Jesuit educated, you've got deeper motivations typically for why you're doing the things you're doing. And you can articulate those in ways that set you apart from your competition. Secondly, tell a story. We remember stories. Stories are compelling. Stories involve understanding how it is you structure your writing and your language. It can also be personal, right? Not too personal, but you definitely want to tell a story if you can. And then finally, make sure they remember you. So keep in mind that most recruiters spend about 6 seconds on a resume before they decide to keep it or chuck it. So you definitely want to get their attention on the resume, but if you write that cover letter, you've given them another opportunity to remember you, like I said before, not optional, but you want to structure it in a way that it's not just a list of what you've done, but more importantly, a story. If you do all that, you're going to look like that. Arms up in the air, not a care in the world. You've got a couple job offers to choose from. So I'm going to take a moment to pause. I've got a couple things toward the end, but I want to be mindful of time and actually hear, I think, from some of our chapter president respondents. It's been a good discussion so far, and I think there's been a lot of great questions. Hopefully the students that didn't ask questions got something out of the responses that you heard. But I believe, Kate, that we've got some students that are prepared to contribute, right?
Well, and you've heard already from a couple of them, Stephen at Holy Cross and Carla at Pacifico, and then David Roberts, you haven't heard quite yet. No, you've had some thumbs up from David from Creighton. And so I don't know if at this moment they have something like they'd like to add. But I can also check and make sure if I'm not missing somebody.
Yeah, things that you want to add, or if there's additional questions, I'm happy to take questions, but I think I'll turn it over to the students now.
I have a question. So I'm thinking about and probably will pursue a year of service with the JVC. And one of my fears is that one of the fears is that I'm going to lose all of my connections at Holy Cross and like my recommenders and like the resources that I have here that would potentially help me find a job or something else after JVC. So I'm wondering if you have any tips on like maintaining connections with Holy Cross or with my institution or with recommenders or networking while I'm doing a year of service.
Yeah, great question. And I'm glad that you brought it up because first and foremost, postgraduate service is an admirable option post-graduation. So kudos to you for looking into that. Anything you do other than full-time employment is a trade-off. Okay, so Grad school is a trade-off because when you're in grad school, you're paying an institution to educate you while you're not getting paid to work. When you're in postgraduate service, you are building a community, presumably in an intentional community, and making a commitment to be frugal and to be, really efficient with your money and time, while also serving a local community through the JVC network. I want you to think less about what the trade-offs are and what you're benefiting from when you do that, right? So the trade-offs are always there. In my opinion, a year of postgrad service extends the discernment process about the career search itself, right? You're going to spend a year in a city you've never lived in before, presumably, working with people you probably don't see every day, usually lower income or homeless individuals or people that don't have as many resources as we do. And you're also doing that in a framework that is going to challenge you financially, right? Because postgrad service organizations are giving you the minimum, really, that you need to live while you're doing that work. So when I think about the outcomes of that kind of experience, I think, well, you've got a network that you didn't have before, right? You've got all the JVCers that are with you in the house or in that city or within the wider network. You've had a year longer than your classmates to decide what you want to do career-wise. And you're in a city that you might want to work in. And you can be networking that entire year if you want to be. So I try to think about this positively as opposed to maybe what might be missing. But I will say that it is a trade-off, right? And so you have to just kind of think personally whether you're willing to make that trade-off. One other thing to share, because I am the chair of the board of Lutheran Volunteer Corps, which is a direct competitor with Jesuit Volunteer Corps. We're not really competitors, by the way. We actually collaborate quite a bit. But I have yet to see any outcomes after postgrad service that are less than impressive. Right. So often a year with JVC, LVC, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, a couple of years of Peace Corps usually leads to really impressive outcomes, whether it's a job that you couldn't have gotten before because now you've got some additional experience, or the network that you didn't have access to before, because you've got a lot of people that have similar values and motivations.
There's a great FJV community, Stephen. So you'll be part of that and be able to tap in. They have a whole alumni group that that stays very well connected.
And Stephen, just to answer I went way beyond your question, but just to answer your question directly, use the experience with JVC, should you choose to do that, as an excuse to update all the people you're trying to stay in contact with at your institution. So a couple times throughout the year, reach out to your professors, reach out to your, to folks that you worked with on campus and say, I just want to let you know that JVC is going well, and here's who I've met, and here's what I've done, and I'd love to pop on Zoom sometime to tell you more about it. What are you up to? So that's as easy as it gets, I think, and that should happen anyway, no matter what you're doing when you graduate. Try to stay in touch with people that you care about.
Okay, great, thank you.
You're welcome. David.
Thanks, Brandon. I had a question. How would you define networking to someone who's never done it before, and maybe how would you recommend using LinkedIn to your advantage?
Great question. Networking is not using people to get a job. Just want to state that because a lot of people think that's all it is. Networking, in my opinion, is forming mutually beneficial relationships. That's it. Right. And so using LinkedIn to find people that maybe went to your institution. Which school do you go to, David?
I go to Creighton.
Okay, so you're at Creighton. So you can go right now to LinkedIn, no matter what kind of account you have. You can type in Creighton University and you'll see probably 50,000 plus alumni that have LinkedIn profiles. You can sort that list by what they studied, where they live, what skills they have, what they majored in, all that. And when you reach out to them, you want to reach out by asking them about their path, right? You're not reaching out to ask about a job or an internship or to get a foot in the door anywhere. You're asking to learn about who they are as a professional because you have something in common. You're both Creighton grads or soon to be Creighton grads, right? Begin that networking conversation by asking them how they got to where they are, what they like about the current organization, maybe some things that they would change if they could. They will naturally turn the conversation to you at some point, and if they don't, you can be diplomatic and do that. that's when you can tell them why you reached out and what you're hoping to get out of, that relationship. But I want you to all understand that when a professional like Sarah or Kate or myself or anyone hears from a student like you, it is validating, because you care enough about what we have done in our career decisions to say, I want to learn from this person. So it's not a one-way street when you network, it's a two-way street. And I can guarantee you at some point, if I were to open a door for you and help you get an interview, that there will be a time, if you keep in touch with me the way that I asked Stephen to do, that 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, you can pay it back to that person, right?
Mhm.
So that's really the mutually beneficial part of networking, in my opinion.
I also think this is a great moment for me to remind everybody to go to the Alpha Sigma Nu website and update your information on your member directory and make sure that we have an email beyond your school email, so that you can, once you you register with us, Amy lets you into the network, and now you can access that network of folks. All of our members across, then there's 90,000 of them across the country and in the world. So that's another place. And we also have a LinkedIn group. So it's a little pitch for us, but you also have a whole nother network out there. And really, even, I know this sounds kind of like, sure you will, Kate, but you can always email our office and just say, do any of you all know someone in this city or in this area? And you'll be surprised. Our board is interested in connecting with our alumni, want to connect with students, not just to give you a job, but in general, they do.
Yeah, and actually to that point, I often hear from students, I feel like I'm bothering them when I reach out.
Yeah.
I send them an email, they didn't respond. If I send another one, it feels like I'm pestering them. At the same time, I hear from alumni, well, they only sent one email. I'm busy. Why didn't they follow up? So for alumni that have made themselves available, if you find them on LinkedIn, if you find them in your alumni database, they're there, they're visible because they want to be contacted. So anything you can do to get over the fear of the awkwardness of reaching out to someone you don't know will pay dividends, because those alumni do want to be contacted.
Mm-hmm.
They'd rather hear from you than from the university, just to be honest. Because you're not going to ask them for money.
It's true.
Other thoughts or questions or comments?
I had a question. So you were talking about, I remember the first slide, I feel, that asked, who am I? And one of the questions was motivation for attending a Jesuit university. And I don't know how it works in other universities, but here in Peru, like when we think about Universidad del Pacífico, we don't think as it was a Jesuit university. We think it's a university with high quality of education, great jobs, and things like that. But maybe if we say that it's a Jesuit university, it can convince more people to study in our school. What is the advantage of studying at Jesuit university? I know about the skills, but maybe there's something else that we can promote.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think most of us, and this is definitely the case with myself, we don't know what kind of institution we're at while we're there. We might have looked at some state or public schools, we might have looked at some private schools, some Catholic, some non-Catholic schools, some in-state, out-of-state. When you graduate and you look back on your education, that's when we start to say, oh, some of my friends went to UCLA and others went to LMU. They're both good schools, but one's public and professional, one is private and Jesuit, right? And so I understand what you're saying about not thinking about it being a Jesuit institution when you went there, but I can guarantee you that graduates of your institution think of it as a Jesuit school. And because of that, they think of the network that they're graduating into as a Jesuit network. So anything that is differentiating about your institutions is an opportunity to be competitive in the job search, right? If you are looking at that map of Jesuit institutions in the United States, it would be important to do research on the individuals that will be interviewing you for a job to find out if one of them went to a Jesuit school,
Mhm.
right? And the goal is to not be creepy when you mention it during an interview, right? So professional stalking is what we call this, right? So you have to figure out, so for instance, a lot of students come to me and I say, well, who's going to be on your interview panel? And they say, well, I don't know. And I said, well, have you asked them? If you ask an employer who will be interviewing you, they'll almost always tell you who.
Mhm.
Just make sure you ask that question early enough to do your own research about who those people are so that you can make some personal connections, right? This is a Jesuit skill set, personable, right? Having empathy, being connected to people, persons with and for others. It's not just a job interview. You're building a potential relationship, a long-term one with someone that you're going to work closely with. So that's another different differentiator, I think, for each of you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I want to be mindful of time, and Kate, you just let me know when we need to wrap, but the only last thing I wanted to share was just an example of how to, I'm always going to promote each of your career centers, because if I could help all of you individually, I would, but your tuition's paying for other people's salaries to do the same thing. And I want to make sure that you utilize those offices as much as you can. Okay, well then I will do one more screen share here and really just go to the final slide, which is to connect with your career center. Do it early and do it often. I think a lot of us are, looking at our graduation coming up very soon, but this is just an example of ways to stay connected, right? And so this is the physical building where we're located on our campus, and I think Summeron, where we are, if you're still on the call, but email, go to the website. Our website has 160 pages. It's all public, right? And so if for some reason you feel like you need more resources than what your career center has, use LMUs, use Santa Clara's, use Marquette's, use whatever is available to you. And remember that there is reciprocal services. So if this is not clear to all of you, I want to make sure you hear me. Any Jesuit student or graduate of a Jesuit institution can use the career resources of any other Jesuit institution. So if you're looking for, if you're based in Boston or Cambridge and you want to work in LA, we have an agreement with Boston College and with Holy Cross to be able to give you access to some of our resources. So reach out to your home career center first and tell them who you're trying to connect to. And that is definitely a tangible benefit of being a Jesuit student and a Jesuit graduate.
Branden, when you said that last year, I was like, what? It's such a cool thing that you can be, we're going to try to talk Carla into coming to the United States for her career. So for sure she'll be contacting you.
Excellent. Excellent.
Maybe I will.
That's really all I wanted to share with you. I mean, I think it's, I haven't done this presentation before. Actually, it's a little different than what I did last year. And so for me, it was really exciting to think about what I know about Jesuit education and to try to make it tangible and understandable for students. And so my hope is that you got something out of it. And for those that are watching the recording later, that it was also beneficial to you.
Great. Does anybody have any other questions? Because as you can tell, Branden is very willing and open to answering them. And one of the things that popped into my head, and I hope somebody is thinking this and not asking it, when you are saying tell a story, I mean, I know I'm a person that might feel kind of awkward about that. Like, well, what's he talk? So if you're doing a cover letter and you're tell a story, like, how short and sweet, like what should, how do you even just like jump into that and put it in a cover letter?
Well, you know what I'll do? I will just send you our page for cover letter.
Wow.
How about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we have a before and an after sample, and so I'll send this in the chat. But LMU has this website. I'm sure others do as well. So when you go to that page,
Wow.
and I can even maybe screen share with you real quick here. This is the page the before and the after.
Got it.
Okay, can you see the after the document?
Mhm.
So just scan
Oh.
that second paragraph. This is a student who wants to work for Adidas. So the takeaways here is that it's one story about one experience, one challenge, one outcome, one deliverable, both for this individual, but also for the organization. They didn't try to pack too many things in that paragraph, but it's really clear what the takeaway was. In this case, it was monetary savings for the organization. And you can really take the framework that I gave you for all 5 of these paragraphs and see it woven in the writing. This is an actual revision to a real student cover letter that we saw a few years back. So Kate, I'm not sure if that answers your question about how.
No, I think it does. And I think the only follow-up I would do on the behalf of maybe somebody who hasn't had as strong of an opportunity in an internship situation, can you do a similar thing even if it's a campus job or a summer job or I'm thinking Natasha was on earlier and she's our student worker. And she does all our social media. And one of the cool things, David and Carla have been the beneficiaries. She does these pictures weekly of and highlights chapter president. So it really has made an impact on our organization, a small one, but it's engendered a lot of excitement and knowledge and really puts a face on our organization. So I think that would be the other question for me, is a simpler thing okay?
Yeah, I mean, you have to use whatever experience you have, right? And so whether that's an internship off campus or a part-time job or an on-campus job or a remote job, right? A lot of jobs are still remote. So don't think that just because your campus job that's been remote for the past couple of years is not valuable. It is. And many of you are going to be working jobs that are completely remote. So I think all that's fair game. We're having this meeting remotely and you're hopefully still getting something out of it. And so just think about what you have to use and take the same strategy to analyze and to write about that. If you have no work experience, hopefully none of you are in that situation, but if you happen to have no work experience, talk about your educational experience, right? Talk about a project that you did that was maybe a presentation or more of a practical thing. Employers will prefer that you lean more toward professional experience when you talk about qualifications. But if you don't have as much of that, you can definitely lean on courses or activities or projects that you've done at your university.
Great, thanks. I just sort of wanted to cover for anybody who's feeling like, well, wait a minute, I didn't work for Nike as a student.
Yeah, I understand. Julia, I think you've got your hand up.
Yes, I do. Hi, Mr. Grimmett. How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm okay, thank you. I was just wondering, how do you do all of that in the cover letter without sounding like you're bragging?
The cover letter is your opportunity to tell a story about what you've done. In my opinion, the only way it can come across as bragging is if you exaggerate, or if you forget to kind of have clear evaluations of your work. So for instance, if you want to show that someone was pleased with your work, you'd want to talk about who that person was and how you delivered them that product and what kind of feedback that you got that showed that it was solid. So we don't have time to talk about the shadow side of Jesuit education, but one of the shadow sides of Jesuit education is that you're all very humble. And sometimes when you're competing for these jobs, other people are not humble, and those are your competitors. So whatever you can do to be really confident that what you've done is important, communicate it clearly and without exaggeration. That is the best you can do. And just don't undersell yourself, because employers will only know what you told them. They're not going to connect any dots unless you do it for them. So if you want them to take something away from your cover letter, resume, or interview, just say it or state it or write it. But my guess is that if you are too timid about that, you may not get the interview, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I think we're a couple minutes
Yeah.
from the end. I
Yeah.
wanted to just make sure to thank you, Kate, and everyone
Oh.
from ASN for hosting, and but also for bringing the group of students together, because I love, in my role, I don't get to work with students directly as much as I'd like to. So this is a great moment for me.
Well, Brandon, having seen both of your presentations, of course, I was still so excited about the one last year, but this one's terrific, really. I don't know if, we want to give you a thumbs up, hand, whatever everyone does, but it was really exactly what I was hoping for. And I'm so grateful. And I hope the gang on the call, on the Zoom, think the same, because I think it's important that they know what they've got and how to communicate it. So
thank you so much. I will definitely follow up after this evening with the PowerPoint if you want to share it with those that were here and that couldn't be here. But thanks again for having me.
Oh, it's wonderful to see you again, even though you are someplace a lot warmer than I am and showing off. So anybody else, final word, or want to say any other final question? You're all good. You're getting a bunch of thanks in the chat, so that's wonderful. All righty. And thank you all for coming and for being part of this, and look for our future events on our social media, email, and on our website. All righty. Thanks again. Thank you, Brandon.
You're welcome. Take care.
Thank you, Brayden. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Oh, I meant to say thank you, Stephen. Thank you, David. Thank you, Carla.
Yeah, thanks for having us.